The desert was on fire. Not with flames, but with the relentless sun of Mesopotamia, a burning sky that seemed to scorch the earth itself. Sand shimmered like molten glass, and every breath tasted of dust. It was here, in this unforgiving wasteland, that Rome's richest man met a death so grotesque, so symbolic, that it would echo through history for centuries. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. To the people of Rome, he was wealth incarnate, a man who owned entire districts of the city, who had turned fire and famine into profit, who commanded legions with the sheer weight of his gold. But to himself, that was never enough. Gold had made him powerful, but it had not made him glorious. He lived in the shadow of two giants, Pompey the Great, conqueror of the seas, and Julius Caesar, the brilliant general who bent Gaul to his will. Crassus was the third man, the financier, the banker among warriors. And so he made a choice that would become his undoing. At the age of 60, when most men would have surrendered ambition for comfort, Crassus set his eyes eastward, toward the vast empire of Parthia. In his mind, it was a prize waiting to be taken, rivers of silk, mountains of spice, and yes, more gold than even he possessed. But in the desert, ambition is a mirage. What Crassus saw as glory, the Parthians saw as greed. And when they captured him, they devised an ending that would transform his lust for wealth into a weapon of execution. The very gold he worshipped would become his final drink. This is the story of how greed, unchained and unrepentant, forged one of the most infamous deaths in all of history. Marcus Licinius Crassus was, by every measure of his time, a man who had already conquered life. He owned more land than entire provinces. His fortune was so vast that ancient writers struggled to calculate it, measuring it in talents of silver, some so large that the modern mind can hardly comprehend. When fires tore through Rome, Crassus would send his private fire brigades, not to save, but to bargain. He bought smoldering ruins for pennies, rebuilt them, and sold them for fortunes. Where others saw tragedy, he saw profit. And when armies marched, he bought the spoils of war, the land of the defeated, and the labor of the enslaved. Rome despised him, yet Rome depended on him. Senators borrowed from him, politicians courted him, even generals took his money. He was, in many ways, the empire's banker. But to be the richest man in Rome was not enough. In a society that worshipped victory and valor, wealth alone was not glory. Standing beside Pompey and Caesar, Crassus could feel the difference like a wound. Pompey was the hero who swept the Mediterranean clean of pirates. Caesar was the visionary who bent entire nations beneath his banners. Their names were carved into Rome's marble halls. Crassus, despite his riches, was a shadow in their light. And so envy grew, slow and corrosive. At 60 years old, an age when others sought peace, Crassus hungered for immortality. Not the immortality of wealth, but the immortality of conquest. He told himself that Rome needed Parthia, its silk, its spices, its gold. But deep inside, the conquest was never about Rome. It was about him. To invade Parthia was to gamble everything. The Senate hesitated, warning of the dangers of desert campaigns, of enemies who fought not like barbarians but like masters of war. Crassus dismissed them. He had waited a lifetime to prove himself. He would not die a banker. He would die a general, a conqueror, a legend. But legends are fragile things. They are built on victories, and destroyed in moments of defeat. Crassus believed his wealth would shield him from failure, that fortune would bend to his will as it always had. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that in Parthia, gold would become his greatest enemy. The year was 53 BC. From the banks of the Euphrates, the Roman war machine thundered eastward. 40,000 soldiers, 7 legions of infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and a host of auxiliaries, moved like a river of iron across the sands. Standards glittered in the sunlight, drums echoed, and the ground shook beneath the weight of disciplined steps. To Crassus, it was the embodiment of power. To his soldiers, it was the promise of plunder. At first, fortune seemed to smile. Small towns surrendered without resistance. Fortified settlements fell quickly to Roman siegecraft. Reports whispered that the Parthian king faced rebellion at home, leaving his borders weak. Crassus convinced himself that the gods favored his ambition. The east would fall as Gaul had fallen to Caesar. The desert would be no match for Rome. But the desert is no man's servant. The further they marched, the harsher it became. Days stretched endlessly beneath a sun that scorched armor and boiled water in its skins. Nights brought biting winds that cut through cloaks and left men shivering on the sand. Supplies ran thin. Wells promised by local guides turned out to be mirages or traps. Still, Crassus pressed forward, dismissing warnings as cowardice. Then came the horsemen. At first, they appeared as distant silhouettes, small bands cresting the horizon, always just out of reach. They vanished as soon as Roman scouts approached, leaving behind only the echo of hooves. At night, strange sounds drifted through the camp, whistles, shouts, the thrum of hooves circling unseen. Sleep became rare. Soldiers awoke in panic at shadows. This was no ordinary enemy. The Parthians fought like ghosts, refusing the set-piece battles Rome craved. They struck supply convoys and vanished into the desert. They bled the legions without ever drawing swords. Crassus, accustomed to enemies who stood and died before Roman steel, found himself chasing phantoms. Yet he refused to retreat. Each step deeper into Mesopotamia was a step further from safety, but to Crassus, retreat meant humiliation, meant admitting that Rome's richest man had gambled his fortune and pride on a mirage. The desert swallowed the legions mile by mile. And on the horizon, unseen but waiting, stood Serena, the young Parthian general who had crafted the trap with patient precision. At dawn on June 9th, the desert floor shimmered with heat though the sun had barely risen. Crassus drew up his legions near the small town of Carrhae, confident at last that the Parthians would be forced into a decisive battle. Roman discipline formed lines as straight as marble colonnades, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, light troops screening the front. The eagle standards glittered like fire in the morning light. To any Roman eye, it was a sight that promised victory. Then, on the horizon, the enemy appeared. Not an army in the Roman sense, no phalanx, no rigid formation. Instead, a tide of horsemen, moving like a single living creature across the sand. At its core, heavy cavalry in iron scales that glimmered like fish beneath the sun. Around them, thousands of horse archers, flowing and circling with terrifying grace. A trumpet sounded, and the sky darkened. Arrows fell in waves, a storm of iron raining upon the Roman lines. Shields locked, but the storm did not cease. The Parthians had prepared supply trains of camels laden with arrows, ensuring the deluge would never stop. Roman armor, designed to withstand swords and spears, proved vulnerable to the relentless hail. Men collapsed, shields bristling with shafts, blood soaking into the sand. Still, the legions held. Roman soldiers had faced storms before. They believed the enemy would tire. But the storm only grew. Hour after hour, the arrows fell. Every attempt to charge ended in failure, the swift Parthian horses pulling back beyond reach, only to return and strike again. And then came the fatal moment. Publius, Crassus's beloved son, young and eager for glory, could no longer bear the waiting. Leading the cavalry on the right wing, he spurred forward, charging the Parthian center in a bid to break their line. For a moment, Roman steel clashed against Parthian armor. But it was a trap. The cataphracts absorbed the blow, while horse archers wheeled around, encircling Publius's men. Cut off, outnumbered, they were slaughtered in full view of the Roman army. Publius fought valiantly, but in the end, he fell. When his severed head was raised on a spear and paraded before the Roman lines, silence gripped the legions. And in the midst of that silence, Marcus Crassus saw not just his son's face, but the shattering of everything he had sought. The banker who longed to be a general was now only a father, broken by grief, standing beneath a sky filled with arrows. The battle did not end in thunder, but in silence. The sky still rained arrows, but the heart of Rome's army had already broken. Men no longer fought with discipline. They fought with desperation. The legions that had once conquered continents now huddled beneath their shields like frightened animals. Crassus, stricken with grief over the death of his son, could barely command. His voice faltered, his orders confused. Officers looked at one another, uncertain whether to obey or flee. The image of Publius's head on a spear still hung in the air like a nightmare that could not be shaken. As night fell, Crassus ordered a retreat toward Carrhae, hoping the city walls would offer safety. But retreat in the desert is not retreat, it is collapse. Exhausted soldiers staggered through darkness, their steps uneven, their ranks shattered. Abandoning heavy shields and armor, they threw away the very tools that had once made them invincible. The desert showed no mercy. Men stumbled and fell, their lips cracked, their tongues swollen with thirst. Some lay down and never rose again. Others collapsed into the sand, trampled by comrades too weary to notice. Roman pride dissolved into a nightmare of dust and silence, broken only by the distant echo of hooves. The Parthians were never far, their scouts circled like vultures, striking stragglers, then vanishing into the night. When dawn came, the survivors staggered into Carrhae. They were no longer soldiers, but shadows of men. The proud legions that had once crossed the Euphrates with banners high were reduced to a battered mob, their standards lost, their spirit shattered. For Crassus, there was no triumph left, only the bitter taste of ruin. He had gambled everything, his fortune, his reputation, his very family, and the desert had devoured it all. But even in defeat, he clung to a fragile hope. When the Parthian general Serena offered negotiations, Crassus grasped at the chance. Perhaps honor could still be salvaged. Perhaps Rome's richest man could escape with something. He did not yet know that the worst was still to come. The Parthians could have killed him swiftly. A sword across the throat, a spear through the chest, and Marcus Crassus would have been nothing more than another defeated general. But Serena, the young commander who had outwitted Rome's legions, understood that some deaths carried more power than victories. Crassus was not just a Roman. He was Rome's wealth itself, the embodiment of greed and ambition. To execute him like any other man would waste the chance to send a message that would echo across empires. And so, the Parthians devised a punishment as symbolic as it was cruel. The fire was stoked. A crucible of gold was placed above the flames until the metal liquefied, glowing with a terrible light. Soldiers gathered, murmuring as the molten gold swirled like a sun trapped in iron. For Crassus, bound and forced to kneel, the sight must have been almost surreal. The very element that had defined his life, transformed into a weapon of his death. They pried open his mouth. He struggled, but his captors held him firm. No final words, no desperate plea could escape. The only thing left was silence. And then it came. The gold poured in a stream, bright and shimmering, into his throat. At nearly 2,000 degrees, it burned flesh, seared tissue, and scalded the very breath within him. He convulsed violently, his body thrashing as the molten metal tore through his insides. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The richest man in Rome, who had once spoken of conquest and destiny, could no longer speak at all. His mouth, the tool of his ambition, was reduced to a grotesque furnace. For the Parthian nobles watching, it was justice. For the captured Roman soldiers forced to witness, it was horror. The message was unmistakable. The man who worshipped gold would die by gold. Wealth, once his shield, had become his executioner. When it was over, Crassus lay still, his body twisted, his face frozen in agony. The molten gold had silenced him more effectively than any sword could. The desert night closed around the scene, and in its silence, the story of Marcus Crassus transformed into legend. His death was not just the end of a man, but the creation of a symbol, a warning that greed, when left unchecked, devours its master. News of Crassus's death traveled faster than the survivors who limped back toward Roman lands. Within weeks, the Senate in Rome was shaken by the unthinkable. An entire Roman army annihilated, its commander executed in a manner so grotesque that it seemed more myth than fact. The defeat at Carrhae shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. For centuries, Rome had expanded relentlessly, subduing tribes and kingdoms with sheer discipline and engineering. Now, in the sands of Mesopotamia, Rome had been humbled. The Parthians had shown the world, and Rome itself, that the empire's legions could be broken, not by numbers, but by strategy and patience. For Rome's ruling class, the political consequences were even more devastating. The first triumvirate, the uneasy alliance of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, had already been strained. With Crassus gone, the balance of power collapsed. His wealth and influence had kept Caesar and Pompey in check, serving as a counterweight to their ambitions. Now, nothing restrained them. In the years that followed, Caesar and Pompey would turn from allies to enemies, plunging Rome into civil war. Rivers of Roman blood would flow, and the Republic itself would crumble, giving birth to the Age of Emperors. In death, Crassus had triggered the very storm he had hoped to escape by seeking glory in the east. To the Parthians, the victory at Carrhae was more than a military triumph. It was theater, politics, and prophecy. Roman prisoners were scattered across the empire, settled in distant lands as living reminders of Parthian mercy. Crassus's severed head was sent to the Parthian king, allegedly used as a prop in plays mocking Roman ambition. Thus, Marcus Crassus lived on, not as a conqueror, but as a cautionary tale, his golden death forever etched into the memory of nations. Marcus Crassus died not as he lived, but as he desired, consumed by the very thing he loved most. His golden death was no mere punishment of the body, it was a verdict upon the soul. Throughout history, writers and philosophers returned to his story. Plutarch described it as a moral lesson, a grotesque but fitting end for a man who valued gold above honor. To the Romans who survived Carrhae, the molten metal was not only a weapon but a mirror, reflecting back the truth of their commander's ambition. And what is that truth? That wealth, when worshipped, is a false god. That ambition, when unchained, devours the very man who carries it. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, yet he could not bear to be second to another. He had everything, land, fortune, influence, yet he wanted more. In chasing glory, he lost his son, his army, his city, and finally himself. But the story is not only about Rome. It is about us. Even today, the desert of Carrhae whispers its warning. We live in an age where wealth and ambition remain the highest prizes. We celebrate those who accumulate endlessly, who pursue power without pause. Yet the lesson of Crassus endures. What we desire most can become the instrument of our destruction. His story is a question carved into history. When is enough truly enough? When does ambition stop being a flame of progress and become a fire that consumes all? The gold that silenced Crassus still speaks. It tells us that power without wisdom is ruin, that wealth without restraint is poison, and that glory sought for its own sake is the most fragile of all illusions. And so, across centuries, his death is not merely remembered. It is endured, as a timeless warning to every empire, every leader, and every human heart.